exciting news. Tickets for the Conference on Religious Trauma, Court 2023, are now available. Also, if you're interested in an ad-free version of the Divorcing Religion podcast, come join me over on Patreon. Links for both are in the show notes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. Today's guest is musician and therapist, Susanna Guarino. Please tell me if I'm pronouncing that right.
That's right.
Okay. Susanna is a licensed mental health counselor in private practice in New York, specializing in religious trauma, spiritual abuse recovery, and couples therapy. Susanna is particularly interested in how religious trauma impacts intimate partner relationships, such as unhealthy patriarchal dynamics that get reenacted, and difficulties with resolving conflicts or expressing feelings. Susanna's own parents met in a fundamentalist Christian cult. She spent a lot of her childhood learning fire and brimstone theology and memorizing verses from the King James Bible. You are in good company there. Welcome, Susanna. It's nice to have you.
Thanks for having me, Janice.
And we just had a little interesting moment of intersection in the fact that you are in upstate New York and in Rochester, and I spent time in Lima, New York as a child because there's a Bible college there, Elam Bible Institute, where my dad felt that Jesus called him to attend. So that was something interesting that we shared. But please tell us how you're doing.
I'm doing good, and I'm excited to be here to talk with you. And I'm also just blown away that we have a Rochester connection, that you spent some time in Lima. Who would have thought?
It's crazy. Yes, it is so funny. The world is smaller than we think it is. That's the truth. I wonder, I hope you'll tell us some of what it was like for you growing up in a home with not only very devout fundamentalist parents, but one that you even in our communication with each other, you have mentioned it as a cult. So tell us what that was like growing up in that home.
Yeah, so my parents met in that group. It was a very fundamentalist. I think my mom would identify it as a cult. I'm not sure my dad would agree. So cult is like a loaded word, but we can at least say cultish group. So they met in that group. They were sort of set up by the elders, and my mom was living in New Jersey, and she came to Rochester to marry my dad. They only went on 3 dates, long distance, before they got engaged. And then, there was that. So the group in Rochester was particularly dysfunctional. There was a very narcissistic authoritarian leader, and it sounds like it just got weirder and weirder. So I was only in that group until I was 5 years old. They got, actually, my mom got excommunicated twice because she kept asking questions and expressing doubts. And I think she was giving them too much trouble. So they excommunicated her, but not my dad, which must have been very complicated for them. But then the narcissistic leader ended up taking half the church and moving to someplace in the South, like Georgia or something. And my mom used to joke, like, at least it wasn't like South America. At least it was, it wasn't a Jim Jones situation totally. But so he left, and then they had like visiting pastors for a while because it was a very small church. And so she went back, even though she had been excommunicated. They rejoined. And it's complicated because in some ways I have these very beautiful memories of all this community when I was under 5. Like, there were always visiting pastors' families staying with us. My mom stayed home and like gardened and cooked food for everyone. And it just felt very like idyllic and like we were part of something, with a lot of unfortunate dynamics too, like how fundamentalists treat children and corporal punishment and stuff. And so when that church finally folded, they just moved to like a more mainstream, but still very conservative evangelical church, where they stayed until, I was 18. So the rest of my childhood. But it was like, what I remember my experience as a kid is we had this community And we went to church 2 or 3 times a week. And there were these really long, like 2-hour sermons. And I remember being so bored and just like sitting there, and they didn't believe in like music or dancing. And so it was very like dry.
No fun for you.
No fun. But there was still community. Like that was like our people. And so suddenly it was all gone. And we had lived out in the country, and we moved to closer to the city of Rochester where my dad worked. And so it was like sudden, like everything you knew is gone, and all these people were gone. And I remember having a kind of visceral experience of loss when we moved to the new house. And I think it was sort of all wrapped up in that. Mm-hmm. And so from there, they continued to raise us in a pretty fundamentalist way. Like we had lots of Bible times, memorizing verses. We went to Awana, which is like Boy Scouts for Christian kids, you know. But unlike some of my friends at Awana who are homeschooled, we always went to public school. My brothers went to private Baptist school for a little bit, and my parents like signed the thing where the principal could spank them if they misbehaved, like in the 90s. Like this is still the world of fundamentalists. It's kind of crazy. But I was just in public school. And so it was this weird dynamic where the indoctrination I was getting at home was really conflicting with the fairly mainstream progressive kids around me. And my brothers and I used to joke, like we were raised for the 19th century, like we were reading Jonathan Edwards, and like we felt like kind of like aliens. And so, but in a way that was really good, because as I got older through high school, I thought about going to Christian college. I was very into religion still. I read the Bible like 3 times in high school, which is crazy to me now. I'm like, what was I doing? I didn't party. I like read the Bible. Like I really missed out. And I thought about Christian college. I had some friends that went to Christian college, but I visited Wheaton outside of Chicago, and they require students to go to chapel every morning at 8 a.m. And I just knew, like, I'm not doing that. Like, no. So that was the boundary for me. I need sleep, and I was 18, and I was like, I'm about to be free. I'm not going to a place where I'm required to get up at such an ungodly hour for a young person. So I ended up going to just a secular state school. I went to the State University of New York at Geneseo, which is near Rochester, near Lima, actually, like that kind of same area. And at that point, I just wasn't surrounded by religious people anymore. And I was kind of adrift and lost, and I wasn't sure what I really felt or believed, but I knew I felt really sort of sad about everything that had gone down.
Were you still living at home, or were you living on campus?
Living on campus. But still, I was very conservative, and I had a lot of kind of judgmental values as a layover from the fundamentalism. So other people were going out partying and making friends, and I was like studying alone in my room, which is sad to me now. I feel like I really missed out, but maybe it was like a necessary period of sort of unlearning a lot of things I had learned and kind of slowly inching out into the world to figure out what the world was all about. So by the end of my time there, I graduated a year early, and my last semester I studied abroad in London. And that was really the time when I just let myself be totally free, just left everything behind and just did what I wanted. So it was like a theater and English program. So I got to go to plays every week and, read amazing British literature. And it was a great group of people, like a sort of small cohort that all went together. So we all got to know each other really well.
How delightful.
It was so amazing, Janice. I'm so grateful for it. So it was kind of like the beginning of just being myself and letting go of all the indoctrination. But it took a long time after that to unpack everything.
And how did that go with your parents?
So fundamentalism long-term didn't really work for our family either. My parents had ended up getting divorced in a sort of explosive way when I was 18. So they were very preoccupied with their own lives. So it was a time of change for really every member of my family. And it actually, divorce was the best thing that ever could have happened, because they just weren't a good match. They had really been pushed by the elders to get married, and my mom
Mhm.
had been accepted to Rutgers Law School. And
Oh,
the elders didn't want her to go to law school and become so independent. So they said,
oh,
well, we found a lawyer in Rochester, New York, who likes you, who's in the congregation, he's in the denomination, and maybe you two should talk to each other. So in a way, she was kind of pushed to give up having a career of her own, to become like the housewife that they sort of expected her to become.
so
And
painful.
it's so sad. So, but she, after the divorce, she was able to get back into the professional world, and she's built a really good career for herself. So it's amazing to see. And I think long term it was good for my dad too. He's still fairly conservative and religious, but he remarried someone who's in that faith with him, and I think they have a very good relationship. So just overall, everybody is happier now that they're
Wow.
out of
Yeah.
that.
And so did your siblings stay religious?
No, none of us did.
And so I'm curious because I was definitely a fundamentalist when my daughters were born and throughout most of their childhood. Now we've all divorced religion. And we do talk sometimes and reminisce, and they have some questions and some memories from those days back when everything was just about obeying the word of God. Do you and your siblings ever talk with your mom about any of that, the stuff from days gone by, or is it just it's just kind of off limits?
Yeah, we have talked about it a lot, which I think I'm really grateful for, because not everybody gets that with their family.
Mhm.
But my parents were very open to therapy. So when I was in late high school, we went to family therapy. They went to therapy. Everybody went to therapy, and there was a lot of channels for talking about things. So I'm so grateful for that.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. I'm really glad to hear that. I feel like that's unusual, and it shouldn't be unusual. I wish
Hmm.
more people would
Hmm.
avail themselves of therapy. Of course,
Hmm.
for a lot of people, it's hard to get there financially. But I'm
Hmm.
so glad that that was something you folks were able to do. I'm also a little bit curious about whether your parents grew up in religious homes, like something, there was a point of vulnerability for them, as there is for everyone who gets sucked into a high demand, high control group
Hmm.
situation.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. So actually, neither of them grew up in religious homes. My dad grew up in like a Catholic Italian, loosely Catholic family, and
Mhm.
my mom grew up in a, I don't know if I would even call it atheist. I'm not sure what their beliefs were, but there was no sort of religious background. But like you're saying, they were both really young when they got involved. So my dad got involved with a group when he was in law school in Albany, and I think it seemed somewhat normal at the time, but it just got weirder. And it's like the frog in boiling water thing, where you maybe get a gut feeling like something isn't right, but it's hard to put your finger on it, and you just kind of go along until you're pretty deep in it. So I think that's what happened for him. And then my mom joined. She's from Los Angeles, and she joined because she had friends who invited her to be involved with like a Bible study youth group type thing. And she was young and she needed friends, and her family wasn't super supportive. So she was kind of alone, putting herself through college. So she was definitely in a vulnerable place, and she just got very deeply into it. And, but she always has been sort of an outspoken, opinionated woman. So I don't know that it was always a great fit. And so the pastors out in LA of this denomination told her that I forget the phrase they used. She told me one time, but she was basically too independent of a woman. And she needed to move to New Jersey to live with a pastor's family who would like straighten her out and like look after her. So
Wow. And
she
teach her
left.
how to be a more submissive
Yes.
woman. Oh my
So
God.
she left Los Angeles and moved to New Jersey at their sort of urging. And that's where she met my dad.
Wow. Yeah. Essentially set up. So not exactly an arranged marriage, but,
Mhm.
and I can relate because it was my pastor who invited my future husband and I over to his place for dinner with the hopes that we would get together. And we did. And we're not anymore. But yeah, it's just interesting all the factors that can go into getting us to the point that we're at now in our life. And there's no going back. We can only look forward and go ahead with the information that we have. But that sounds like such an interesting growing up. And I'm really pleased then that relationships were able to be preserved within your family unit, that you still have relationships with your parents and your siblings. I'm so glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're so lucky. And I work with a lot of clients who come out of families like this and they don't have that, or they have family members who are very judgmental of them or cutting them out, or just really difficult to deal with and talk to now that their beliefs have changed. So I've seen how it can go the other way and be really hard for people.
Yes, that's true. One other thing you mentioned that really rings true for me, because it also was my experience. So my parents were devout Christians and believed the Bible was true and inerrant and all this stuff. We never had enough money as a family for us to go to the Christian school. So we always went to public school. And I felt so divided, sometimes almost just paralyzed, because there would be the preaching on Sunday and all those things, and knowing what my parents expected, and then to be in a completely alien kind of foreign environment with kids who were not religious at all. The only ones, like maybe there would be one poor Jehovah's Witness kid who was just a total outcast from everybody, and that was just so heartbreaking. And I certainly didn't want that to happen to me. So then just felt like I was always walking this line. What could I do? I had, like they say, a foot in both worlds. I didn't really feel like I belonged. So that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Yeah, that's so relatable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so you graduated early from university. You were able to have this amazing term in London, which is just so cool. And then what degree did you end up with after that?
So I had a bachelor's in English literature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then something got you interested in psychology.
Yeah. So at that time, I really wanted to be like an artist of some kind. I was like a theater kid, and I was very into writing and music. And I was playing a lot of music and writing songs in my early 20s. I still do that. But I wanted something a little more stable career-wise. And so I did a year of AmeriCorps, which is like the domestic Peace Corps here. So you volunteer for a year and you get a government stipend. So I did that in Rochester at a healthcare clinic for people without insurance. And the therapists, there were a lot of therapists in training there, and they let me sit in on a narrative therapy training group for a whole year. Wow. So I just loved it. And it seemed like, a wonderful fit because I'm so interested in people's stories anyway. And so after that year of AmeriCorps, I went to graduate school to become a therapist.
Wow. Wow. And now you're still living in the same city where you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
I always find that so interesting. I'm back in my hometown now too. And I'm glad to be here. So you went into psychology because you were, as you say, interested in people's stories. And then at what point were you kind of piecing together your own, the possibility that you may have experienced religious trauma of some sort? Were you kind of doing that ever since you were in college, or was that something that came later that you were understanding, maybe there's some marks that God left there?
Right. I think I must have always known it on a gut level. As it was just kind of mixed up with everything that I was processing in my 20s. The 20s are really like can be a really intense time when you grew up in one of these families because you're suddenly free and you can think for yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, what did I just spend my whole life so far doing and thinking? So it was an intense time. I went to therapy in my 20s, which I'm very grateful for. That was really helpful. And I think I'm trying to think of when I first even heard the term religious trauma, because when I was coming out of this, it wasn't talked about as much, and there wasn't so much social media stuff. So I kind of did it on my own. And I think it's great now that there's like your podcast and there's other podcasts and there's so many resources out there for people.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in your 20s, when you then were working with a counselor or a therapist yourself, were they able to understand? Because that's something I do find. I hear from clients who end up coming to me because they say they're either the therapist that they had been working with is religious or is not religious and has never had any influence from religion and really does not understand how pervasive and tenacious religious beliefs can be, especially when we are indoctrinated from birth and we're not really given room to explore or think anything else.
Yeah, exactly. I would put my therapist in my 20s into that category, maybe, who just wasn't even aware enough to ask more questions about it. She was a family systems therapist, so she was really interested in the family system, but there was less about like the bigger context and like just what indoctrination over time does to people and family systems. So she was a wonderful therapist and I got a lot from working with her. But that's one reason it's important to me to be putting myself out there as a therapist who does this work, because I want to offer that to people, like that sort of understanding.
Nice. Yes. And did you find that that there were any particular teachings from the church that were hard for you to shake, like any fear? I know fear of hell is a big one for a lot of people. Of course, a lot of fallout from purity culture indoctrination. Were there things for you that were kind of extra sticky and required some more attention?
Yeah, I think there were. Purity culture was tough to, shake, because it goes so deep into your body, like it's such a deep reaction that you have. I think just general feelings of like, I'm a sinner, shame, I'm not a good person, like, because there's so much fear and shame indoctrination in those groups. Like you're really taught that there's something wrong with you and you need to be saved. So even when you're out of it, you're still left, and you no longer believe that with your brain, but you're left with the feelings of like, I'm bad or I'm not safe.
Right. And it sounds like your parents have been able to love and embrace you regardless of what you believe or don't believe. But we know that's not the case for so many people who grow up in fundamentalist homes. And then there seems to be the only choice is either you continue towing the line, it's what we believe religiously, or that's it. We can't continue having contact with you. Or if they do, it is just very surface level. And that can be so painful for people who already have suffered trauma from being in the religion and then again from leaving the religion, which really is kind of the religious trauma syndrome that Dr. Marlene Winnell talks about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Like leaving it is just as hard as being in it. And it takes a really long time. Like I would say it took me at least 10 years to feel like it was really behind me.
Yes. And then even sometimes when we're still in that time of kind of exploring what happened to us, if we are entering into relationships with other people, sometimes these things come up at unexpected moments, or certainly by the time people are in their 20s or mid-20s, they're for most people, a lot of people, there has already been some sexual experimentation, or they have a thriving sex life, or whatever it is. But for those of us who grew up forbidden from entering into any kind of those behaviors, it can be almost paralyzing sometimes, the degree of fear that we are saddled with. Is that something that you see in your practice?
Yes, I have seen that. And I've seen it show up in other ways in relationships too, because I do a lot of both couples therapy and individual work. In couples therapy, I've seen people continue to kind of struggle with black and white thinking. Like, we're raised believing in good and evil. Like, it literally, there is good and there's evil. And so in a relationship, you really need to be able to hold ambiguity and complexity, and just kind of be okay with the other person seeing things really differently from you. And that can be a little harder when you were raised fundamentalist too, I think.
And one thing that I noticed when I was reading out your intro there, that you are interested in how religious trauma impacts intimate partner relationships, including unhealthy patriarchal dynamics that get reenacted. And so what you just said made me think of that. So I'm thinking of my own growing up, and I hear my dad's voice in my ear telling my mother what she has to do. She's an adult, but she didn't have a choice as far as he was concerned. And does that sort of thing come up? Is that how patriarchal dynamics show up in your practice? Again, where we're talking about the black and white thinking.
Yeah, I mean, they can be sort of automatic, like learned habits almost. So for women, the habit might be like sort of deferring or not speaking up or becoming a little codependent or submissive. For men, it can be a little like kind of an entitlement that they're maybe not consciously aware of to women's labor, emotional, mental, and physical. I think that's true in secular culture too. It's not just people with religious trauma. It's kind of all couples that I see. There's usually some of that. But also it can impact the expectations that people have for each other. So even for women, they might have some expectations still that the man will be like the leader. And if, they didn't happen to marry someone who's very like assertive or has that personality, they might feel really disappointed. So kind of both ways, there can be unmet expectations and problems like that.
It does make me chuckle as I'm thinking back. So I, at one point became very conservative, much more so than my parents ever were. And I started wearing a head covering. And the reason I started wearing a head covering is because my marriage was difficult. And the man that I was married to, he was more of a laid back person, not a terribly assertive person. And I felt that the Bible was clear in saying the man is to be the leader of the household. So when I started wearing the head covering, it was to remind myself to be more specific, that's more submissive. Every time I put it on, that's what the reminder to bite my tongue rather than always trying to. And he did not like it. He didn't like then feeling like he had to be thrust into making all the decisions. And it's so, just like you say, then there was resentment on my part. I'm sure resentment on his part, just so difficult and ridiculous to me now when I'm looking at how old the Bible is. It was written in a specific time for a specific culture with specific issues that were going on, specific information that they had then. So to take it and insist that it is still the standard, 2,000 years later is just not going to fly.
Yeah.
So crazy.
It's still the standard and it's all literally true. Nothing's metaphorical. Speaking of black and white thinking,
Exactly. Oh yeah. Just having to tie yourself into a mental pretzel to make everything fit when we don't leave any leeway for part of it to definitely be metaphorical, and part of it is poetry, and some of it is very specifically looking at the problems of the age. But there wasn't even that wiggle room. And I'm thinking of your mom too, when she was told no, she absolutely was too much. She had to become less. And that's how I felt, that I was constantly trying to make myself less than I really was. And that's so sad.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it also precludes the chance of a real intimate relationship that's based on authenticity and being able to resolve conflicts and talking openly and transparently about your thoughts and feelings.
Oh. And I mean, growing up in a fundamentalist home, we did not have the opportunity to watch or listen to problem solving, because my dad would just get worked up, and as he's getting louder, and then he's shouting, and then there's going to be a fist through the wall potentially if someone doesn't back down. So then, my mom, her whole thing was just being quiet and doing then what he said, or what he wanted. So that was the example for me as a female child, as a girl in the family. If I had been taking notes at the time, it would have been that I am to bend over backwards to keep the peace at all costs, and to always be catering to my husband, and letting him know that he was the boss, and not pursuing my own interests at all. And that's not fair. That's not kind. That's not right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. In my case, it was my mom would do the deferring thing and try to be the submissive wife, but she actually was extremely just not her personality to be like that. And so it was like this conflict internally for her, I think. And she had tons of resentment about the situation she was in and her sort of role. And that would come out a lot. She was just so angry about it. So it was bad for everybody.
Yes. Yeah. And so then divorce comes along, and it came along for me as well. And one thing that I tell my clients that I work with now is that divorce is not a failure. Divorce is just a transition. It's just, we're changing directions. We don't need to feel like we failed. We don't need to have bad feelings associated with it. We can radically accept this is a change that is happening in my life now, without putting moral blame onto it.
I love that. I think that's so important. And a lot of people raised in fundamentalist or evangelical cultures need that destigmatization of divorce, because I think they sometimes can stay in marriages that are just, maybe not so healthy for both of them anymore for way too long. Like my parents were married for 20 years, but they went on 3 dates before they got engaged. Why did they do that to themselves? They weren't a good match. Like, it's fine. But they really needed the destigmatizing of divorce, and it took a long time for that to land home for them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's just so interesting. Did your siblings go into careers in the field of mental health as well?
No, they're like tech. They're in software and math and numbers and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about your practice, maybe the types of people who are coming to see you. Are you largely working with people who've left a religion? Have they already left? Are they just questioning? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, I get a lot of people who grew up in conservative, fundamentalist, or evangelical cultures and are kind of either in the process of leaving or have left. And I also work with couples sometimes who have that in their background. Either they grew up that way, or one of them they might have joined as adults and then left. I see fewer people who are still in it, probably because my website is pretty explicit that I work with people with religious trauma. And when you're in it, you might not be sort of ready to acknowledge that kind of phrase.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That the religious trauma happens to people in other religions, not their
Right.
religion. Yeah, I have definitely heard that before. One dynamic that I have found interesting and challenging is uh, when one spouse remains a very committed believer and the other spouse is completely done with it, wants nothing more to do with it, but they have children and they don't want to divorce, they want to keep going. But if the parent who is still very much involved in fundamentalism is then terrified that their children are going to hell or that their spouse is going to hell, it's virtually impossible for that not to come out, and that can just be so terrible, particularly for the children who are then trapped in the middle. Is that something that you see at all?
Yeah. I have seen that, but I've seen it more in cases where they don't have children, which I think makes it a little less. The stakes are somewhat lower. They're still high,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there's no easy answer to that one. It's just really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It is difficult, and I do work with my clients around the idea of practicing acceptance and radical acceptance of what exactly is the situation that's in front of them. I know a word that comes up sometimes for my clients is forgiveness, and I call that the F word when I'm working with clients who've left religion, because the whole concept of forgiveness has been weaponized to a large degree in order to enable predatory behavior, and including patriarchal behavior, but of course also all sorts of terrible abuse situations that can go on in churches and actually in organizations that are set up with the patriarchal hierarchy. So we really work on acceptance rather than forgiveness, because then people feel guilty. Why can't I forgive? I know I should forgive. I can't do it. And I say, I've got great news for you. We are not going to be working on forgiveness. We're going to be working on acceptance, the reality that this happened to you or this was done to you. And that can be our place to stand and look around and make a clear decision about what we need to do next. What's a good step to take next, rather than feeling stuck in unforgiveness, as people say.
I love that. That sounds really healthy to me and like a great reframe, because I also have a negative association with the forgiveness word, which in my experience also was used to kind of whitewash over problems or make it so there wasn't conflict, when really the conflict would have been healthier to try and figure out what had really happened between people or what was needed for reconciliation.
Yes, yes, and it can also be very difficult for people who grew up in really fundamentalist families. If they get to a point where they recognize, so they have left, they're no longer fundamentalists, they're generally not even religious anymore, but the parent remains a diehard fundamentalist, and in fact can be toxic for that person. And then sometimes, in some cases, a step is made to try and preserve and protect the client's own mental health. And that might look like not having communication with that parent again. And it may be temporary, or it may be for the rest of their life. But that's another one that can be really hard. Obviously, that's a big decision and not a decision that a person would take or make lightly. I don't know if that is anything that goes on in your practice, if that's, because that's such an individual thing, but is that something you've seen before?
Yeah, I have had clients struggling with that, especially clients who are on the LGBTQ spectrum. And when they have really fundamentalist families, it's like every time they interact, they're just feeling like hated and not seen. And that's another one where there's no easy answer. Um, you know, my bias is probably that when you can maintain at least a superficial relationship, better for you over the long term, even if you need to keep them at arm's length. That's kind of my bias, but I also understand that there are some situations where the client feels like it's better for them to end contact, and I support that too. It's a very difficult decision for people.
Yes, and I do tell clients that it's okay to outgrow your parents' expectations and hopes for your life, particularly when it comes to, they really hope that you just stay religious and settle down with a nice, husband or wife, whatever their notion is based on their religion. And just, understanding that we can outgrow that. Oh, excuse me, my cat is sneezing here. Steve. Giving ourselves permission. We don't have to get stuck living our parents' dream for our life. We're allowed to go beyond that to fully embrace and build our own life.
That's a really important part of differentiation.
I think so too. So what else would you like us to know about your practice or about working with couples? Are there specific things that couples can and should be working on just in general to help keep their relationship moving along nicely?
Yeah, so I'm trained in Gottman method. I've done all their trainings. I'm on the certification track. And so I draw from a lot of what they do. So when I work with couples, we do a really thorough assessment first. So we understand what are the, communication lapses and what are the strength and challenge areas here. So the first session we do the history of their relationship, and we go back in time to how they met and then talk about ups and downs. And it's really in depth. And then the second session, I meet with both people individually so I can get to know them a little bit better and more about their backgrounds and how they see things. And then they do an online assessment that I send them. And then the third session, we go over what their goals are for couples therapy and what they want to be working on, and challenge areas and strength areas for them.
Wow. And you can do that with couples who come to you who aren't religious, who are religious, or who even are mixed there. You can still use the Gottman method with them. John Gottman, he made one of my favorite quotes ever, which is something to the effect of, with every interaction, we're either building our house or tearing it down. And I think that is so powerful in every relationship, in every interaction that we have with people. We can be building or we can be tearing down. I just love that. I think he's brilliant.
That's a great quote. That's really true. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So you work with couples and you also work with singles. So you must have a lot in your toolbox that you can be drawing on.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a sort of long-term supervision in psychodynamic therapy. And so I find the psychodynamic approach is really helpful for people with developmental trauma, including the religious trauma, because it's kind of like peeling back the layers of the onion and figuring out what really is happening here. Where does all this come from? So that definitely informs my work with both individuals and couples too. And then the other thing I really like with individual work is just the acceptance and commitment therapy and some CBT stuff, but thinking about, like you mentioned, radical acceptance and values, how do you want to live now?
Values clarification work is so important when we have been raised with a very specific set of values imposed on us, really, from not only our parents, but from their religious belief structure. And so when we leave that, it's really the time for us to be looking at, well, what are my values now? And sometimes we're not even sure. We don't even know what we like. Sometimes I have clients start out with what they don't like or what they don't want, because that can be easier for them to grasp more quickly. But I do think it's an important thing for us to take a look at our values now, And we can even do it in a compare and contrast way. My values now compared to what they were, my values compared to my parents' values, and to recognize some of our values may change over time. It's true. We're allowed to change and grow and change our minds even.
Right. It's very freeing to realize the values imposed on you from someone else you actually have a choice about, and you can evaluate whether they work for you, whether you believe in them.
Oh, yeah. And such a big one when we grow up in fundamentalism is this whole notion that we must honor our parents or respect or obey our parents. There are lots of good parents out there, and there are lots of parents out there who do not actually deserve to be honored because they did not parent in an honoring manner, or however you would want to say that. And that can be a big piece for folks to get over as well. We can really struggle with guilt around that sometimes.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, that makes me think of, have you read Tara Westover's memoir, Educated?
It's wonderful. Mm-hmm.
So great. And her parents are, just so difficult. I could imagine that in her case, it's probably better for her to have very little contact with them, but it's also really sad.
Yes. And there's another book out called Uncultured by Daniela Mestianic Young. And her family was one of the original families that developed the Children of God cult. And she just graduated, I think, from Harvard. And she will be speaking at the conference on religious trauma, actually, in October. And so I would like to thoroughly go through her book before then. But the bits and pieces I have read about it so far, it just reminded me a little bit of Tara Westover's story and situation.
I'll have to read that. When is the conference in person or virtual?
The Conference on Religious Trauma. Thanks for asking. It's also abbreviated CORT, C-O-R-T, and it's online, and it'll be happening in October. This year, it'll be October 20th to 22nd. And we have psychologists and social workers speaking, as well as survivors. We are going to be paying some special attention this year to child marriage within religious groups in the United States. I think that's a really important topic. There's going to be a lot going on. So I'll have links in the show notes for people to get their tickets to the Conference on Religious Trauma. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, that sounds really wonderful.
And I'm so curious about your music. Tell us about your music. Are you still making music? Is it just for fun, just for you? Would you say it's a passion? Are you in a band?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. I do still do it. I love it. I am in a band. We don't play out very often anymore because one bandmate now has 2 kids, and I'm running a private practice, and life gets busy the older you get. But we play out a few times a year, and I still write songs sometimes, and I'm taking fiddle lessons right now. So maybe at some point I'll be playing fiddle. But
oh, cool.
Yeah, I sing and play guitar, and I have 2 albums on Bandcamp if anyone wants to check it out.
Nice. Bandcamp. Okay. I love it. And so you're learning to play the fiddle and you play guitar. Is there any mandolin? You can be throwing some mandolin in there, or any other stringed instruments?
I don't have a mandolin. Oh, no. But I play a little piano too.
Very cool. And is that something, a love of music, did that develop when you were a child? I'm trying to remember. It didn't sound like your church was very much fun. They probably didn't have a lot of music going on. So tell me about that love of music. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, we left the really fundamentalist church where there was, it was very puritanical. They were Puritans, like neo-Puritans, basically.
Yes.
So, luckily enough for me, we left that when I was 5, and then we were in the evangelical world. So we went to a church that got sort of like mega churchified towards the end. But there was lots of music. There was lots of opportunities to sing and play in a band there and do drama. Like I used to do church theater. And so it was actually, that's a great thing about church. And that's why I don't believe in divorcing religion entirely. I believe in divorcing like authoritarian controlling religion. But I think there's so many positives too, in terms of bringing people together and giving, like, even young people having the opportunity to learn things like music or being able to do things like that. So,
yes, particularly if it's not quite as fundamentalist as of a setting as a lot of churches are. But yes, I think you're right. That's where I'm sure that's where my love of music and singing came from. Also, was from time spent in church, and then of course doing a drama at the church as well in my teen years. So there can be good things that we can take away, or I want people to search for threads of meaning and purpose that they can still take with them into their secular life. Some people aren't able to do that. The whole situation was just too much, too traumatizing for them. But for the rest of us, there are sometimes some things we can look at and say, yeah, that part wasn't too bad.
Right. I like just how complex it is. Like it's real life. It's not all good and all bad. It's radical acceptance, I guess.
Oh boy. And that whole idea of things being, let your yes be yes and your no be no, and don't be lukewarm, and all that stuff that we were taught. And that really is a fairly immature way to view the world and move through the world. So part of the maturing process, we go from being meaning seekers to meaning makers. We start taking responsibility, figuring out our values. What do we like? What do we want to do? What is so important to us that we just feel like we absolutely must do it? That's one way we want to leave our mark on the world. And also, as we mature, we are moving into places of nuance and more shades of gray rather than that black and white thinking, because the black and white thinking can really screw things up. Wow, I can't believe we've already been talking almost for a whole hour. Is there anything in particular that you'd like to share with our viewers and our listeners? Any lesson that's been important to you? Anything related to your counseling?
Yeah, well, if they're interested in, so I'm licensed in New York, Rhode Island, Arizona, and Florida. So if they're in those states and they would like to work with me, my website is goodearthcounseling.com. So it's www.goodearthcounseling.com. And then if they're interested in checking out my music, that's my sort of musical world. I went by Susanna Rose, which is my middle name. So if you search Susanna, well, I think susannarose.com is still a website from my 20s that came together. And then all of my music's on Bandcamp under Susanna Rose.
Very nice. Oh, good. And also, you had mentioned doing Gottman kind of therapy. So we'll include a link in the show notes for people who are interested in looking that up. It's just been a real pleasure talking with you today. Thank you, Susanna.
Likewise, Janice. I went by so quick. I would love to talk to you again.
Me too. Okay. Everyone, thanks for tuning in and take care.